Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Realism and the Absence of Reality, Art's Cross to Bear. The word will never represent form in all of its palpable fullness, just as none of the arts, except the verbal, will ever express plots, stories, dialogues, deductions, and instructions. Ilya Repin. Realism, badly named, at any rate often badly interpreted, consists not in copying the real, but in copying a depicted copy of the real. It copies what is already a copy. Roland Barthes. Well, hi everybody, and this was the painting that started me off on this particular theme. I was actually going to start a video on Dostoevsky to back up the live stream I did on Brothers Karamazov, and I was looking for images to accompany Dostoevsky's text, and I remembered Ilya Repin's work and went back and looked at it, and this painting's always intrigued me. It's not got a catchy title. The full title of the painting is Ivan the Terrible and His Son on November the 16th, 1581. And Repin painted it 1883 to 85. And it was based, he went back in history because at the time Tsar Alexander had just been assassinated and the people responsible were executed. And all of this was going on. And he was trying to process the emotion and the general febrile atmosphere in Russia without falling foul of the censors. So he went back to an incredibly emotive, violent act in the past that would give him enough insulation. And he was classed as a realist painter. And as you can see, he approaches reality in painterly form without it. It's quite straightforward, not abstract in the slightest. And that made me think, because there's one thing missing in this painting, which is the mouth of Ivan the Terrible. And you've got the eyes, all the expression is in the eyes, but the mouth is pressed into his son's head, and it's the horror of what he's done. So he's killed his own son, and I just can't think of many portrayals of, without lowering the tone, it's a bit Britney Spears, and oops, I did it again, or it's this horror, all in the eyes, but the mouth is hidden. And I'm going to address that particular theme. The idea that you can actually achieve more by withholding something being absent. And that's why he's on the edge, Repin, because he's a realist painter, and yet, we'll see later, he also did some much more abstract things. But already, even if you're trying to be a realist painter, and there's lots of politics because it leached into, or flowed into Soviet realism, and this idea that art should have a message or a social function. It shouldn't just be art for art's sake. There were historical and political messages and relevance in Repin's work, but also it was ahistorical, as he shows in this painting. He can go right back in time and you feel you're there, you feel part of it. But this effect that he achieves by not showing the mouth, and I'm going to show various artists later on who did show the mouth, and I'm going to show you writing about, you never would have realised how significant the mouth can be in art. But this withholding of it, and then ironically, paradoxically, achieving an even greater effect. So that's one idea, and I'm going to link it to towards the very end, the concept of the crucifixion and the cross, and some depictions of that have also relied upon less is more in a way. So this is a painting just called The Crucifixion from circa 1892. By an artist called Nikolai Nikolaevich G, which I believe is a northern Russian pronunciation that I've just delivered. It's difficult to pronounce it without sounding like a James Bond villain. But this was a member of the same, they were called the Wanderers. It was a group of artists of which Ge and Repin were both part. But in this particular example, I'm pushing this forward as something that loses something of its effect because it's trying to be too explicit. So again, though, it's interesting that it's a very explicit portrayal of the suffering on the cross, but there's a centurion in the background walking away, and I don't think the painting was ever properly finished, because that seems like a half... I know maybe he wanted to give the impression of the centurion disappearing, but I think I was reading that there's suggestions he kept reworking it and it wasn't fully finished. And you've got the deliberate choice of the criminal on the right being crucified, who you just see the arched agony. You don't see the actual face. The other criminal, the face is also is darkened. So Christ is the one the light is upon, and that's the really explicit pain being portrayed, whereas the others are more implied or scarce or partly hidden. So if you can just bear this one in mind as quite an explicit portrayal. So in the realist tradition, trying to show things quite clearly and straightforwardly in a visual sense. And we can argue backwards and forwards over, what is more effective ultimately when you're trying to portray reality, showing more of it or using the conventions and the formats of various artistic forms, withholding something, but arguably achieving the essence of reality. And that's what this whole talk is about. This paradox whereby, whilst trying to portray reality, you need, ideally, to hold something back in order ultimately to achieve a greater effect. And we'll just see how much I can convince you of that. But this is one of my favourite artists, Jean Fautrier, and it's called Christ on the Cross from 1929. And this is what led to the thumbnail, this detail from it. And the question here is Fautrier achieving more by providing a much more abstract portrayal? And this is the theme that's going to run throughout this talk, the relationship between the explicitness of a presentation and the realistic nature, or the realism of its effect. So this is Ilya Repin from... So he had a long life. He died in 1930. I think the last of the paintings I'm going to show by him was 1922. So he painted very late on into his life. I think from memory he lost the use. I think he was right-handed naturally. And by the end, in 1922, when he was doing his final paintings, he had to use his left hand. He was just decades of painting in bad conditions. His right hand just rather atrophied. And he was a member of this as the Peredvichniki, the Wanderers. Again, I'll just make one apology to all Russian speakers, and then I'll just pass over my pronunciation. So this is from one of his memoirs. I was returning from an exhibition in Moscow where there was a Rimsky-Korsakov concert. His musical trilogy, Love, Power and Revenge, so captured me that I desperately wanted to represent something akin to the force of his music. Feelings at that time were weighed down by horrible contemporary events. Such was the general mood of life. These paintings stood before our eyes, but no one dared paint them. It was natural to search for an escape into an even greater tragedy from history. So that just explains what I was saying about the assassination of Alexander the Great. And to contrast Repin's painting, this was Vyacheslav Schwartz, Ivan the Terrible beside the body of his son, 1864. And just to compare and contrast the two, there's something about it's just in the eyes, and I need to wax lyrical about this for a while, but there's something about the Repin painting that it's on the edge of kitsch. So it's been criticised by various critics, who I'll talk about in a second, as being kitsch. And that's another theme to think about. To what extent can you portray reality, or attempt to portray reality, through realistic means and exaggerate certain aspects to create an effect without losing the overall effect? And one way of thinking about it, or the difficulty of trying to engage with representations of reality, I came across this wonderful quote from Ford Madox Ford. So from his book, Joseph Conrad, A Personal Remembrance, and it's all to do with the difficulty of, in any art form, trying to represent reality. Life does not say to you, in 1914, my next-door neighbour, Mr. Slack, erected a greenhouse and painted it with Cox's green aluminium paint. If you think about the matter, you will remember, in various unordered pictures, how one day Mr. Slack appeared in his garden and contemplated the wall of his house. You will then try to remember the year of that occurrence, and you will fix it as August 1914, because, having had the foresight to bear the municipal stock of the city of Liège, you are able to afford a first-class season ticket for the first time in your life. You will remember Mr. Slack, then much thinner, because it was before he found out where to buy that cheap Burgundy, of which he has since drunk an inordinate quantity, though whisky you think would be much better for him. Mr. Slack again came into his garden, this time with a pale, weaselly-faced fellow, who touched his cap from time to time. Mr. Slack will point to his house wall several times at different points, the weaselly fellow touching his cap at each pointing. Some days after, coming back from business, you will observe against Mr. Slack's wall. At this point, you will remember that you were then the manager of the fresh fish branch of Messrs. Catlin and Clovis in Fenchurch Street. What a change since then! Millicent had not yet put her hair up. You will remember how Millicent's hair looked, rather pale and burnished and plaits. You will remember how it now looks, hennaed, and you will see in one corner of your mind's eye a little picture of Mr. Mills the vicar talking, oh, very kindly, to Millicent after she has come back from Brighton. But perhaps you'd better not risk that. You remember some of the things said by means of which Millicent has made you cringe, and her expression, Cox's aluminium paint. You remember the half-empty tin that Mr. Slack showed you. He had a most undignified cold, with a name in a horseshoe over a blue circle that contained a red lion asleep in front of a real gold sun. So it's Ford Madox Ford is doing a tongue-in-cheek, but only partly, because if you think about it, this is how modernist literature reads. It's trying to capture the stream of consciousness. It is not a million miles from James Joyce, but it's trying to capture the stream of consciousness, which is, in a verbal way, a more realistic portrayal than could be obtained by writing a more conventional narrative with a much firmer beginning, middle, and end, because in reality our thoughts are much more concatenations, these random associations that go on in our heads. So this all goes to Ford Madox Ford's point is that reality is not, as Bart pointed out at the beginning, it's not an easy one-for-one correspondence thing. And then just to show you that Repin himself, being a realist painter, throughout his career, it didn't stop him experimenting and showing you. I think the next picture shows you certain things don't lend themselves to a more realistic portrayal. So they don't know the date for this. I think this was logged in his estate after his death in 1930. It was logged in his estate, I think it's written on the back, in 1932. But it's called The Temptation of Christ. And I'd argue that this is more effective because it's more abstract. There's this demonic presence of the devil tempting Christ, and the ethereal nature of how it's portrayed I think, conveys the story that many people are familiar with much better than if it was a much more realistic portrayal. But anyway, this is all by way of preamble, and I'm going to get stuck in. But before I did so on Repin's work and some of the themes I wanted to draw from it, I wanted to cover myself. This is a critic, Clement Greenberg, and he's referring to a battle scene painting by Repin. So Repin pre-digests art for the spectator and spurs him effort, provides him with a shortcut to the pleasure of art that detours what is necessarily difficult in genuine art. Repin, or kitsch, is synthetic art. So that was a review in the Partisan Review magazine, 1939. So Greenberg is criticising Repin for one particular painting, a battle scene painting, but also Greenberg had it in for Repin. He thought he was just a kitschy artist. And then in 1972, there was a reprint of this essay, and this is the postscript that Greenberg had to publish. P.S. To my dismay, I learned years after this essay saw print that Repin never painted a battle scene. He wasn't that kind of painter. I had attributed someone else's picture to him. That showed my provincialism with regard to Russian art in the 19th century. So, whilst claiming that Repin was a kitsch artist, he wasn't even compos mentis enough, Mr. Greenberg, to actually make sure he was talking about the right particular paintings. It's also interesting, in those days, of course, you didn't have the internet, so these things weren't as readily checked, and you just wonder how many of these clangers were dropped by art critics. But this is Molly Brunson's wrote a book, and this is one of the chapters, and it describes the actual effect of the Repin painting of Ivan the Terrible, how it caused it to be physically attacked. There were no other visitors in the gallery yet. The silence was such that every step was audible. Suddenly a sharp sound resounded throughout the whole gallery. It sounded as if something cracked. At first I thought a painting had fallen. Then suddenly I heard a loud thwack, and then tch, and then another thwack, and another tch. Some kind of noise and a bustling broke out in the Repin hall. I flew there, as did the other employees, and Khrushchev, the museum curator. The two employees had seized a young man, Balashov, by his hands and were trying to wrench a switchblade from him. The young man was screaming, "Enough blood, down with blood." His face was pale, his eyes mad. At first I did not know what had happened, what had produced those noises. Who was this man with a knife? Looking at the painting of Ivan the Terrible, I was stunned. There were 3 horrific, gaping slashes through the painting. The edges of the slashes were a piercing white. The primer coat underneath the paint had been burred. The threads of the canvas extended out from the slashes like tiny pointed teeth. It seemed to me that the painting had been ruined forever. I saw Khrushchev shaking, all pale, not knowing what to do. So this is an account of in 1913 when the painting was attacked. So if this is a detail that I'm just absolutely fixated by. And obviously, it's always had quite a profound effect, so it can be dismissed as kitsch, but I'll describe later, it was after 1913, it was also attacked later on. But this was the attack in 1913, a black and white photograph of it. So it just shows you how badly that description of the little teeth of the canvas, quite apt. And then this was the response of a critic to this attack. It is astonishing that no one has realised that in Balashov we do not have a criminal, but a victim of Repin's work. His madness was aroused by Repin's painting. He is guilty insofar as he believed Repin in full. He was deceived by the most naturalistic and most natural representation of a horrible event, and could not endure the position of a weak-willed and idle witness. He shattered that protective, invisible glass that separates us from a work of art and threw himself inside the painting as if it were reality. So that was relating to the first attack. And then this was a second attack in 2018. A Russian guy had taken too much vodka and used, from memory, it was a metal pole and just attacked the canvas. Repin's Ivan the Terrible relies on the production of an analogy between represented history and the present moment in order to shatter the protective field between art and reality and affect the viewer in a markedly visceral manner. It is this blurring of art and reality that allows for the human and the bodily to enter into an otherwise disembodied historical narrative. So Brunson's arguing that there's something about Repin's ability to drag you into history. And I will be showing you in future another Repin painting called Barge Pullers on the Volga. And he does have this amazing ability to drag you in, which goes to, the whole theme of this talk is the idea of the way in which you can portray reality in a realistic fashion. Despite in any art form, it's always a representation. Obviously, it's never going to be truly real. But to what extent can you successfully psychologically draw someone in to the feeling that they're sharing some type of past reality, in this case, in history? And I'm just showing this for a bit of a laugh, but this is Tsarina Sophia from it was when it was supposed to have been painted. What it's depicting as events from 1698. Repin painted it in 1879. But for any married men out there, they will recognise this look. And often the phrase, "Have you done the dishes?" will be mentioned. And I think this is an incredibly realistic portrayal. That was actually, I don't know whether you noticed it in the painting, but that is what most married men look like psychologically when they're being berated. But anyway, to pursue this theme, this was a guy who wrote this work. So, Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Sculpture, 1755. And what he wrote about was picked up by this guy. So, Laocoön, or On the Limits of Painting and Poetry. And this is quite a famous Lessing. It's a very famous essay, and it relates to this sculpture that was found in the, I think it was the 16th century. It's a first century, they think, first century AD Roman statue. And the idea is, it refers to Laocoön and His Sons. So I thought, if you just have a look at it, and then I'm going to read you the section of Virgil's Aeneid where Laocoön and the serpents are referred to. So it's book 2, and these are the lines from the Aeneid to show you how all this relates together, the sculpture, the paintings, and the literary work. Through these tricks and the skill of perjured sign-on, the thing was credited, and we were trapped by his wildliness and false tears, we who were not conquered by Diomed or Larissa and Achilles, nor by the 10 years of war, nor those 1,000 ships. Then something greater and more terrible befalls us wretches, and stirs our unsuspecting souls. Laocoön, chosen by lot as a priest of Neptune, was sacrificing a huge bull at the customary altar. I should have said, for those not familiar with the Aeneid, it's about the Trojan War, And this is the prelude. Laocoön he's a priest and has been telling anyone who listen that the Trojans are being tricked by the Greeks, and that the horse outside the gates is a trick, and no one will listen to him. So the Greeks send these snakes to kill him. See, a pair of serpents with huge coils snaking over the sea from Tenedos through the tranquil deep, I shudder to tell it, and heading for the shore side by side, their fronts lift high over the tide, and their blood-red crests top the waves. The rest of their body slides through the ocean behind, and their huge backs arch in voluminous folds. And this is a replica of that's an attempt to, because it was broken, the original was damaged. This is the early 1800s, I think, a plaster cast that's at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. So it's been finished artificially, if you see what I mean. There's a roar from the foaming sea. Now they reach the shore, and with burning eyes suffused with blood and fire, lick at their hissing jaws with flickering tongues. Blanching at the sight we scatter, they move on a set course towards Laocoön, and first each serpent entwines the slender bodies of his two sons, and biting at them devours their wretched limbs. Then as he comes to their aid, weapons in hand, they seize him too, and wreathe him with massive coils, now encircling his waist twice winding their scaly folds around his throat. Their high necks and heads tower above him. And this is an unknown 18th century artist who did a marble version. He strains to burst the knots with his hands, his sacred headband drenched in blood and dark venom, while he sends terrible shouts up to the heavens, like the bellowing of a bull that has fled wounded from the altar, shaking the useless axe from its neck. But the serpent pair escape, slithering away to the high temple, and seek the stronghold of Fear's palace, to hide there under the goddess's feet and the circle of her shield. So this is the legend, and this is Winckelmann that Lessing quotes to set up his argument. So Winckelmann's basic idea is that the Greeks and Greek art was full of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. So that was Winckelmann's description of what Greek art is all about. So as the depths of the sea always remain at rest, let the surface rage as it will, even so does the expression in the Greek figures show through all the suffering of a great and calm soul. This soul is portrayed in the countenance of Laocoön. That's the original spelling of portrayed, by the way, and not in the countenance alone. Notwithstanding the intense severity of his suffering, the pain which discovers itself in all the muscles and sinews of the body, and which from these only, without considering the face and other parts, we seem to perceive in the agonized expression of the belly alone. This pain, I say, expresses itself nevertheless without any torture in the face or in the general position. He utters no horrible scream, as Virgil's verse makes his Laocoön utter. The opening of his mouth does not show this. It is rather a subdued groan of anguish. So Winckelmann's describing how on the face of Laocoön you don't see this screeching, wide open mouthed. It's quite subtle. And actually, we'll see in a second, most of the tension and the violence of the sculpture is in the torso of Laocoön twisting and fighting the snakes. So Winckelmann was the person who wrote about it, and then Lessing wrote a whole book because he wanted to develop the idea of the extent to which art dealt with the portrayal of beauty and how it dealt with things like pain. So he was trying to argue that Winckelmann, I'll just briefly explain the context, it's not really that significant, but Winckelmann, according to, and this is disputed, But according to Lessing, Winckelmann was trying to argue that the Greeks just had this repressed emotionality that they valued as part of their culture. Whereas Lessing wanted to present that argument so that he could actually counter it and argue it's much more about the nature of the art they were using. That sculpture, for example, does not lend itself to extreme facial expressions. So Lessing was trying to argue it's much more to do with the medium of the art form they were using. But like I say, there's a debate within scholars as to how accurate Lessing was doing the way he presented. It was a bit of a straw man argument he presented from Winckelmann. So this is Lessing. Wrath is diminished into severity. The Jupiter of the poet who hurls the thunderbolt is wrathful. The Jupiter of the artist is severe. Lamentation is softened into sorrow, and when this mitigation cannot take place, if the lamentation should be equally degrading and disfiguring, what did Timanthes do? His picture of the sacrifice, Iphigenia, in which he distributed to all the bystanders their proper share of grief, but veiled the countenance of the Father, which ought to manifest a grief surpassing that of all the others, is well known, and many clever things have been said about it. So what Lessing is now doing is arguing that different art formats express emotion differently. So in poetry, because it's verbally based, you can go think back to Repin's epigraph at the very beginning of this talk, but poetry deals with words, so it can deal with the emotion through words. But this is describing how an artist, a visual artist, has to soften. So Timanthes here is an artist, he's a visual artist, so then the reference is made, and I don't think there are only copies or portrayals of what the original Timanthes picture was supposed to be, and this is an added level of complexity. The painting that's being spoken about by Timanthes has never been found. It's been lost to posterity, but people wrote about it, so there's a tradition of it being referred to. And the picture's about Iphigenia and the sacrifice Agamemnon made of that. Iphigenia was Agamemnon's daughter, and he sacrificed her. He might easily have passed over or have softened what was hideous, but inasmuch as his composition did not permit him to do either, what resource remained but to veil it? What he might not paint he left to conjecture. In a word, this veiling is a sacrifice which the artist made to beauty. It's an example not how an artist can force expression beyond the limits of art, but how an artist should subject it to the first law of art, the law of beauty. So this is the painting, or a copy of the painting. It's not the original, but this is the story of Iphigenia and Agamemnon that's being referred to. So the whole story is Agamemnon offends the goddess Artemis on his way to the Trojan War. He hunts and kills one of her sacred stags. She retaliates by stopping the allied troops from reaching Troy, and says in order to reach Troy, you'll have to sacrifice your eldest daughter, Iphigenia. And that's what you can see there. And Agamemnon is got his hand over his head, and he's got a cowl on. And the point Lessing is making is that this is necessary because in a visual form it would be too dramatic to show the emotion. And by veiling the face like this, you're actually implying much more emotion. So this goes back to the original theme of the whole talk, this role of absence. Just like Repin doesn't show the mouth and the pain of Ivan the Terrible through the mouth, here you don't see the face at all. And if you're looking for, I thoroughly recommend this novel He's an English author. I think he died in around about 2010. I think his most famous novel would probably be Sacred Hunger, but he did this, which is just a short novel all about Agamemnon's sacrifice. It's brilliant. And then he did another, I'm just trying to think, another novel I'd thoroughly recommend by him was one called Morality Play, which was about, it's a fictitious origin story of how drama in the theatre started, because morality plays were religious plays put on as actors went from town to town in medieval times. And he describes how a murder takes place in one of the towns and they write a play in order to portray the murder in the hope of capturing the murderer. So it's the first non-religious play. And on the back of that, so it's very cleverly done. And it's about the role of imagination and art in medieval times and how it evolved from religious plays. So Morality Play is a brilliant novel. And I think this is, if you're interested in this whole story of Agamemnon, this is a great one I'd recommend too. But back to Lessing. Let anyone only in thought force wide open the mouth of Laocoön and judge. Let anyone make him scream and then look. It was a creation which inspired sympathy because it exhibited beauty and suffering at the same time. Now it has become a hideous, horrible creation from which we gladly turn away our face because the aspect of it excites what is unpleasant in pain without the beauty in the suffering object, which can change this unpleasantness into the secret feeling of sympathy. So he's suggesting you couldn't have the statue screaming and still retain its grandeur. And that's the older son, Antiphantes. And this was the point I was making earlier about the tension isn't in the face so much as the torso. It's like looking in the mirror. So again, this is all Lessing until the quote says otherwise. Art has in these modern times greatly widened its boundaries. Its imitative power, it is said, extends over all visible nature, of which the beautiful forms but a small part. Truth and expression are its first law, and as nature herself always sacrifices beauty to higher views, so must the artist also subordinate it to his general design, and pursue it further than truth and expression allow. It suffices that through truth and expression, the most hideous thing in nature is changed into the beautiful of art. He's being sarcastic here, I should emphasize. So he's suggesting that art has lost its roots in beauty. And when it privileges truth of expression, in other words, realism, if truth and expression are its first law, and as nature herself always sacrifices beauty to higher views. So the whole section here is about him criticizing the idea that beauty can be sacrificed for other purposes in art. Lessing's argument is that beauty is the key thing. So suppose we allow this idea to pass unchallenged as to its merit or demerit. Are there not other considerations independent of it which nevertheless oblige the artist to observe moderation in his expression and not to choose for representation the most extreme point of action? I believe that the single moment which the material limits of art confine all her imitations will lead us to such considerations. So this is crucial, because what he's suggesting is that with painting in particular, there's a single moment, sculpture too. You're trying to capture a single moment in time. And that has consequences for how you try and portray. It's this frozen point. How do you portray a frozen moment? If the artist out of ever-changing nature cannot use more than a single moment, and the painter especially can only use the single moment with reference to a single point of view, if their works, however, are made not only to be seen but be considered, and considered for a long time and repeatedly, then it is certain that this single moment and the single point of view of this single moment must be chosen which are the most fruitful of effect. That alone is fruitful of effect, which leaves free play to the power of imagination. The more we see, the more we must aid our sight by thought. The more we aid our sight by thought, the more must we believe that we see. So I'm interpreting when he says the more we see, he's talking about quality, not quantity. And I think this draws attention to some of the key issues around the role of the imagination. If you contrast, so I'm not agreeing with everything Lessing says, I think he over eggs the pudding regarding all art has to be beautiful, as I'll show you shortly. But this idea of imagination and the power of the imagination, the role in which that alone is fruitful of effect, which leaves free play to the power of our imagination. I'd ask you to consider in contemporary times how little role there is for imagination, because whether Lessing's ultimately right or wrong, I think he is right about the role that imagination plays in art and the gaps that a good artist expects us to fill in ourselves. He doesn't provide the absence. He uses absence in his or her artistic representations, and we're supposed to use our imagination to fill in that absence. So what happens in a modern society today, where there is less and less room for us to do that role of active imagination? But in all the gradations of a passion, there is no moment which has less this advantage than the moment of the highest degree of the passion. Beyond this there is nothing, and to show the eye the extremest point is to bind the wings of fancy, and to compel her, inasmuch as her power cannot go beyond the impression on the senses, to busy herself with feeble and subordinate images, beyond which is that visible fullness of expression which she shuns as her boundary. So this is actually describing the current situation we have, where we busy ourselves with feeble and subordinate images. When Laocoön sighs, the imagination may hear him scream, but when he screams, then it can neither advance a step higher in this representation, nor descend a step lower without beholding him in a more tolerable and therefore in a less interesting condition. You either hear him groan for the first time, or you see him already dead. I just think that's brilliant writings. He's basically suggesting, or I'd argue what he's suggesting is that the power of art, if not the beauty, lies in this tension. It's getting that sweet spot before you either hear him groan for the first time or you see him already dead. If you hear the groan with too much detail or you see him already dead, the tension of the effect is already lost. Moreover, if this single moment obtains through art an unchangeable duration, then it ought to express nothing which in our conception is transitory. All phenomena, the character of which we consider to be that they suddenly appear and suddenly disappear, that they can only be what they are for a moment, all such phenomena, be they agreeable or shocking, obtain, when prolonged by art, so unnatural an appearance that their impression becomes weaker with each repeated inspection, and ends in our feeling disgust or fear at the whole object. So he's basically describing, if you're not careful, if you present something in too a realistic or too extreme a form, then repeated viewings diminish the overall artistic effect. The grievous pain which forces out the scream either soon ceases or destroys the sufferer. The most enduring man screams, but does not scream incessantly. Excuse me. And it is only this apparent unceasingness in the material imitation of art which reduces his scream to a womanish incapacity and a childish intolerance of pain. This, at least, the artist of Laocoön had to avoid, even if the screaming would not have injured beauty, and even if it were permitted to his art to express suffering without beauty. So again, I think it's quite interesting. This is arguably describing the contemporary situation where we have an excess of overly realistic portrayals. And the way he describes it, the grievous pain which forces out the scream either soon ceases or destroys the sufferer. It's this contrast he's talking about between art as trying to capture one moment in time. Reality is ongoing. So there's a mismatch. And if you're not careful, the captured moment of a beautiful piece of art gets diluted and ruined if you're trying to, rather than capture that moment, give a more realistic portrayal of the progression of time. And this is the constant tension. Sculpture or painting, according to Lessing, are trying to capture beautiful moments in time. They don't lend themselves. And there's a realism in that. There's a reality of the beautiful moment. But you can't, in that format, capture the passage of time in the same way. That's a much more verbal mode of art, as was described right at the beginning in Repin's epigraph. So we're coming to the end of the text, and there'll be loads of images you'll be glad to know from now on. But Timo Makers perfectly understood and knew, so this is this artist that no one's seen the original, but it's been referred to in classical writing. Perfectly understood and knew how to combine that point at which the observer not so much sees as surmises the crisis, with that phenomenon with which we do not necessarily connect the idea of the transitory, as to render the prolongation of it displeasing in a work of art. He has not painted the Medea at the moment in which she actually murders her children, but some minutes before, while maternal love was still struggling with jealousy. We foresee the end of the struggle. We shudder by anticipation at the mere sight of the savage Medea, and our imagination goes far beyond what the painter has been able to draw in this terrible moment. So this is what's being referred to. The idea is that it's Medea kills her children that she's had with Jason, of the same Jason as Jason and the Argonauts. So they've been married for 10 years, and Jason intends to abandon her. I think it was King Creon's daughter, Creusa, he was going to leave her for. So, the ultimate act of spite, Medea decides to kill the two sons. And this is a 1st century AD fresco in Pompeii that was discovered. And I think Lessing's point here is that the tension you're getting from this is knowing what's going to happen. So I think what you can do is you can show something just before it happens or just after, and you get the effect of the emotion of the event. Paradoxically, it's less realistic emotionally to show the act being committed, because you don't get the tension of just before or the horror of just afterwards. So the afterwards would be Repin's Ivan the Terrible painting, and this is a similar horror of before the act is committed. And this is the paradox of art. To a certain extent, this is more realistic psychologically. This is more realistic, maintaining the tension of something that hasn't happened yet. And art is what captures that moment in time. So this is a similar thing about Ajax. Did not appear as he vented on the fury on the herds, and bound and slew oxen and goats. So Ajax has had this manic, frenzied reaction. But the master painted him as he was sitting exhausted with these mad acts of heroism and taking the resolution to slay himself. And this is really the mad Ajax, not because he's at the moment mad, but because we see that he has been mad, because the intensity of his madness is most vividly apparent from the shame and despair under which he's now suffering. We see the storm in the wreck and the corpses which are thrown upon the beach. So now, just to wind up, but to enter the final stretch of this talk, to give you some, I'm sorry there's been a lot of text, but to give you some visual illustrations of all this now. So this is Lessing again referring to this statue of the serpents attacking the father and his two sons. The scream had to be softened to a sigh. This is all about Laocoön. The scream had to be softened to a sigh, not because screaming betrays an ignoble soul, but because it distorts the features in a disgusting manner. The wide open mouth, aside from the fact that the rest of the face is thereby twisted and distorted in an unnatural and loathsome manner, becomes in painting a mere spot, and in sculpture a cavity with most repulsive effect. So what I've done to this point is I've described, it's quite a dated piece of work by Lessing, I accept that, but he's identified, and you could criticise him for having identified just the beauty of art, as that's what he says is the convention that needs to be upheld at all costs. So from now on towards the end of the talk, what I'm going to ask is, to what extent can that convention be broken? And this is what is interesting about conventions in art. As long as the conventions are known, you could then choose to break them to achieve a different artistic effect. But at least the convention's having some respect paid to it, even if it's only to be broken, if that makes sense. Whereas, again, arguably, what's lacking, or what in non-artistic culture industry things like TV and film, that are lowest common denominator, they're not the best. Arguably what they do is not pay attention to either the convention of beauty or consciously playing with the convention for artistic effect. So this idea of a sculpture in a cavity which most repulsive effect. This is at the Palazzo, is it Via dell'Arco di Gnesi in Rome. And I think it's the phrase is apotropaic. It means warding off the evil eye. So these are figures of the Medusa. And for apotropaic purposes, so in order to ward off the evil eye, you're not bothered about whether it's beautiful or not. So this, what was previously described as this repulsive cavity in stone, this is Caravaggio's picture of the Medusa. And what I'm arguing here is that these are images that go against the convention that Lessing is trying to propose or defend, this idea that all art should be beautiful. And the question is, to what extent can you make it terrible without falling foul of the things that he warned against, the way in which pictures can be ruined by being too extreme? So these are in some ways presented as a counter-argument to Lessing, although in Lessing's defence, it is this thing about if you know the convention and then choose to break it, in some ways you're still paying respect to the convention. So this is Nicolas Poussin, the Massacre of the Innocents from circa 1628. And it's horrific, but I'm showing it you because this is what influenced someone like Francis Bacon. So I've used, this is the still from Battleship Potemkin by Eisenstein from 1925. And on the right-hand side is Study for the Nurse by Francis Bacon in 57. And the argument is that he was influenced by Poussin. I think there was, I'm pretty sure he had a paint or a reproduction of Poussin, or in his workshop afterwards they found the Eisenstein picture. But also I'm pretty sure Bacon went on record as saying this was one of the most dramatic paintings in his view. But this idea of, go right back to the beginning, Lessing arguing that in the Laocoön statue you shouldn't show the mouth, and Repin not showing the mouth in the Ivan the Terrible. But here are examples of what happens when you, knowing that it's not going to cause something beautiful, you play with the convention of beauty, and arguably Francis Bacon achieved the beauty of the horrific, if that it's not a contradiction in terms. And he had a lifelong obsession with the mouth. So on the left-hand side, it was a French translation of a German medical textbook. He got that image of the mouth from. This is just a scrap they found in his studio. And on the right-hand side, it's part of, it's a detail, it's the central panel for 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, because I'm going to develop this crucifixion theme towards the end now. That's 1944. Now, I'm not claiming that Francis Bacon is beautiful, but there's definitely something about it. He's captured an essence of what a mouth is, that on the one hand is incredibly, it's like the most mouthy a mouth has ever been. It's incredibly realistic while simultaneously not being realistic. It's what happens, it's an artistic question, what happens when you take realism to the nth degree? And it leads to, movements like surrealism. I think I've shown this before. This is Landscape with Pope / Dictator from 1946. And I just love the way there's a parallel between the microphone and the mouth. Just this, his whole obsession with the disappearing mouth. This is Study for a Portrait, 1949. This is Head 4, 1949. Study for a Portrait, 1952. This is Head 1 from 1948, and I think this was from The Mouth of a Chimpanzee is what inspired Bacon for this one. So remember, all of these images are in the context of Lessing suggesting that the statue of Laocoön doesn't show the mouth open because the nature of sculpture requires that it doesn't, because that would ruin it, because of this notion of capturing one moment in time. And I'm offering these images from Bacon, and I'm going to show you Edvard Munch in a second, as the counter-argument that if you know what you're doing, you can take the convention and break it, but achieve something simultaneously realistic and artistic. And when I say realistic, it's capturing an essence of something. So it's realistic in that sense, in a psychological sense, but it's not realistic in the sense of a realist work of art that shows you very closely, without too much artistic interference, the image of something that corresponds to reality. So it's the basic distinction between figurative art, something that represents something directly and recognizably, and more abstract, more evocative art, where it's capturing the essence but not the superficial reality. And then you get into discussions what qualifies as actual reality and what qualifies as superficial, seemingly looks like reality, and to what extent is art's job not to provide the superficial but to get to the essence of reality. And then we're right back to this: what's the relationship between realism and reality, and to what extent do you use something that's absent to portray something that underlies reality? So in this image, there's lots not being shown, but there's something primal about the open mouth of a chimpanzee stroke human being that Bacon's captured, that he couldn't have captured if he'd have done something much more conventionally realistic. Likewise, Edvard Munch, this is 1893. And this time you've got the combination of the fluidity of the lack of solidity. He's representing both with colour and the shapes on the canvas. The fluidity of a breakdown, the anguish, the angst. And in that context, the open mouth contra Lessing isn't ugly. It achieves something in the overall context. The scream. Different versions. This was 1910. And then the colouring, the lighting conditions are different. And then it's interesting to see when you just go completely to black and white. And then I'd suggest if your kid produces something like this with their crayons, it may be time to worry. Or they've not had a good day at school. So again, Brunson, I like this argument she makes. The point that's worth emphasising is that realism does not equal mimesis, in other words, imitation, direct copying. In representing reality, realism must always grapple with the distance between art and life. It is within this distance that the most astounding solutions are to be found. Ones that may in fact seem quite unrealistic, but that are nonetheless realist. I think that's what I was saying just before, but more clumsily. More importantly, when works of artistic realism do cross into subjective or spiritual or imaginary realms, they are not violating their own aesthetic commitments. In these instances, they do not become hybrid, romantic, or proto-modernist, but rather exploit the inherent paradoxicality of realism itself. So I describe this almost like the Goldilocks point, where she says, more importantly, when works of artistic realism do cross into subjective or spiritual or imaginary realms, they are not violating their own aesthetic commitments. They're exploiting the inherent paradoxicality of realism itself. And to go back to the beginning, realism must always grapple with the distance between art and life. So art and life are always going to be distant because one is a representation or an interpretation of the other. And arguably, the more art dutifully just reflects reality, the less artistic it is. So there's this perennial, eternal paradox that art seeks to reflect something, but if it reflects too much, It's basically a mirror. It's no longer art. Despite being motivated by a desire to achieve mimetic proximity, in other words, to be close to representing reality, realism is forever aware of the impossibility of this project. It's in its willingness to persevere in the face of this most certain failure, and not in a willed ignorance of medium and convention, that realism distinguishes itself from modernism. So arguably, realism as an art form is just a bit more stubborn. It's prepared to know that trying to represent more realistically is doomed to failure, but trying anyway. Whereas more modernist methods, they're all on the same team in the sense they're art trying to achieve an artistic effect. But there's different ways of going about it. So back to I mentioned one of my favourite artists of all time, Jean Fautrier. This is The Massacre 1943. He had a series called L'Otage series, the Hostage series. And the context, it's horrible context. He took refuge. A friend got him a room in a psychiatric hospital in the suburbs of Paris. Valais or Lou, I think it was, in the suburbs of Paris. And he used it as a studio. So it's a big old, relatively safe house he's in. But he's on the outskirts of Paris, and in the nearby woods he could hear the Gestapo torturing people. And this goes directly to, if you tried to paint that realistically, what would you achieve? Whereas he's portraying here almost the floating heads of these victims, which I'd argue is much more effective in conveying the psychological reality of what the events that were taking place, horrific as they were. I think this is Tête d'Otage #1. And I think he pretty much pioneered this haute pat. I think they're called raised pastes is the technique. So you can't see it on the screen properly, but there's an impasto, there's all this layers of paint that he's built up that gives so much contoured surface to the face. And back to this, I'm sorry if I'm expressing myself clumsily, but the emotion or the depth he can achieve in the absence of a conventional human face. It's the absence of a conventional human face that actually has the overall, or creates the overall effect. And I don't know why, but this is a picture of the damage that was done to the Ivan the Terrible. You can just see the depth of the cuts into the canvas. And then to finish with a reappraisal in the light of everything I've been talking about, a reappraisal of Repin. I'd really defend him against the accusation that he's kitsch. So this was, I think this was after he died, but this is a Russian writer. And he's claiming Repin for socialist realism purposes. So the idea was that he was a good Soviet painter. And he wasn't, in the sense that he started off, I think he was very sympathetic to the Soviet cause, but Repin was scandalized by what the Bolsheviks did. And he lived, I think after the Second World War, it became part of the Soviet Union. But Repin lived near St. Petersburg, in Finland it was part of. I think after the Second World War, where he lived became part of the Soviet Union. But he was in Finland when he died. Repin's positive and favourite heroes, along with whom he also expresses his own moods and thoughts, are the revolutionaries from the intelligentsia and the peasantry. Repin sought life's beauty in the revolutionary underground of populism and the people's will. He found and reaffirmed that beauty in his great canvases. He created a mighty historical monument. Only enemies of revolutionary art can heap dirt on Repin's great revolutionary legacy. The working people of the Soviet land love, respect, and deeply value him. And why I'm showing you this is someone ideologically trying to claim Repin. And I'd argue strongly that good art defends itself from ideological capture. And I'd argue there's much more in Repin's work beyond kitsch, but also beyond crass social realism for political purposes. So I've used this image before, but this is a portrait of the author Gashin from 1884. Vsevolod Mikhailovich Gashin. And it's back to this less is more. It's one moment in time. And now I'm going back and saying I'm more sympathetic to Lessing, his argument about art capturing one moment in time, because I just think this is a beautiful portrayal of sadness and depression. And Gashin suffered quite profoundly from melancholia. And this is the composer Mussorgsky. It was Repin painted it in 1881. And there's something about it I have found very poignant. And then I read that he died, I think, about 4 days after the final sitting for this. It's just the skill with which he gets the eyes. And then interestingly, this was why I'd argue he'd never be a good socialist realist painter, because Repin had a orthodox faith. So this was Golgotha, or Calvary, it's also known as, from 1869. And it goes back to, I think, those two previous paintings. Everything's in the eyes. It's less is more again. This is more busy, and it's obviously much more totemic, and it's much more on an epic scale. And this is, I think, Golgotha, or Death and Resurrection, from 1896. Now, I'd argue, sorry to go back, I'd argue that and that are not as good as when he actually uses absence. So this is called Ecce Homo from 1867, and I think that's much more effective than the other two, the previous two. It's the absence, it's what's not shown, it's the implication, it's the illusion. And to give you another example from Francis Bacon, this is called Crucifixion from 1933. And then back to bring everything together by showing Christ on the Cross, Jean Fautrier again from 1929. And then to finish off with some Repin paintings of the crucifixion, just to put them in context, this is Psalm 22 I'm going to read to you, which was, they estimate, approximately written in 1000 BC at the court of King David. So 1000 BC, so over 1,000 years before the actual crucifixion, but this is Psalm 22. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. But be not thou far from me, O Lord, O my strength. Haste thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. And this is Repin's painting Golgotha from 1921 to 22. I think he did one other, but this is argued to be his last major canvas, and it was actually, at the time, it was so difficult to get painting supplies. It was actually painted on the back of linoleum, household linoleum, a big piece of it. And he was 78 years old at the time he painted it, using his left hand, the wrong hand, in a cold studio. And if you look to the lower right, this is the detail. And that's in the background, that's the light. The heavy implication is that's an indication of the resurrection. So what you're seeing in this picture is the absence, the actual cross that Christ was on is lying on the ground. But the power of this painting is the absence of Christ. And that light, talking about absence, I'd go back just to finish with the final image again from Fautrier, basically the thumbnail for this video. But I'd argue, speaking as an agnostic, I think this is a brilliant representation of faith, to the extent that you can either see the light there despite the absence of Christ. And the question for agnostics, I suppose, is, can you see the light in the eyes? Or is it absent? Well, till the next time, all the very best. Take care.